What are we doing?
What are we doing? And we're live. We're going live.
Oh, cool.
We're going live. We're going live, guys. Here we are. We are live with Layne. I'm live with Richard Dreyfuss and Professor of History David Miller and my very good friend Ron Blackburn.
Hey guys.
So excited to have Richard here with us this afternoon to talk about the Civil War. He has some excerpts that he's going to read. We have some amazing artifacts from the Civil War that David's brought this afternoon, so we can look at some of those things. And I think we're ready to get into a pretty amazing conversation. We've been here for the last hour and a half just chit-chatting about all kinds of stuff. And I'm like, why are we not recording this? You know, it's kind of some of the pre-interview was so interesting. So I'm really happy to have you all joining us this afternoon. And without any further ado, would you like to read an excerpt, Mr.
I would.
Dreyfuss? All right.
I would. This is an excerpt from something I wrote a couple of years ago. There was a man named James Hammond. He owned, I think, more slaves than any other plantation owner in the South. He was famous for that. He was famous for a couple of things. And I'm going to read this to you the way I wrote it. Because historians have a habit of not only glossing over the parts of the story that doesn't support their version, or they think that it's not relevant when it is so relevant. And so this is a part of a very important man's life, and this is a part that is not normally talked about. James Hammond of South Carolina, intellectual, gracious to most, at its most vivid. I say most because he is feverish and alarming in his corrupted soul, and is as inhumane to his slaves as a natural-born rapist can be. The pen in his hand is scratching across the paper. His other hand is forcing one of his female slaves to kneel between his legs, her mouth on him, and he speaks the words he writes. She is even now pleasuring me. We see that the book he writes is his diary. From outside, a sound turns into a louder protestation and anger. The front door is kicked in by a man who is named Wade Hampton, Hammond's neighbor and brother-in-law. Hampton strides towards Hammond's den with a hawk's unblinking concentration. Hammond is up, fearful, the writing and the rape forgotten, as he tries to escape through a garden door into a lovely flower bed. But Hampton's handgun presses furiously into Hammond's head, and he stops. And he whispers. The man with the gun whispers, "Say one word, beast, and I will paint your brains on the walls of your home." Talking right into James' ear so only he hears. Raping niggers is an obscenity, James. But they are your property, which is a stench I thought I could live close by to, although it makes me want to vomit at the sight of you. But you've started down a more depraved road now, James, haven't you? Would you not think it as neighborly for touching, say, a daughter of mine, or any white girl you happen upon, if I brought you faster to hell? Hammond's mouth opens. Wade pulls back the trigger. Don't speak. Filth. Ever again. If I hear that you have spoken in public, or do anything more than eat and breathe in this house, I promise you on God's grace that you will die, and you will suffer before you die. Hampton glances down at the diary. His face pales, hardens. Hampton pulls the pistol away from Hammond's head. He picks up the book as if it was a living scorpion and puts it down on the table near him. As he looks, there on the stairs, still as marble and just as white, Mrs. Catherine Hammond, her face dripping with tears. Hampton, looking up at Hammond's wife with the pitilessness of an angry god. You will keep this monstrous thing inside these walls, or I will do all and worse. God help him if he speaks aloud and I get word. I will turn your family name to shame. Never let him out. You hear? He befouls our lives. And as he strides by the weeping woman on the staircase, without pausing, he departs with an enraged, Catherine, you and your family are now and forever outside the bounds of any society. He exits. On the disreputable mansion's occupants, we hear Mark Twain's voiceover. Pretty definitive, had you asked me. Clear, cogent, a tad bellicose, but certainly in keeping with the circumstances. And that's how you meet James Hammond. Later on in the story, which is called History, which is true, 20 years later, James Hammond gives a speech on the floor of the Senate, probably the most famous speech ever given in the United States Senate. And he gives it as a senator from South Carolina, so that either Wade Hampton changed his mind, or Wade Hampton died, or maybe it's that what he did and what he said is perfectly okay now, because evil is like a plague, and the toxic nature of that evil has succeeded in conquering every man. And what he says in this Senate speech is a phrase that has come down to us as cotton is king. And it was in a speech in which he threatened the North. He threatened the northern senators and said, if I could find it, I'd read it to you. He said, if you don't stop trying to interfere with our peculiar institution, we will bring you to your knees, because we have cotton and the world wants it. And they will come to us as beggars, and we will keep it from you. So, stay away and stay off our backs, because cotton is king and trumps anything you got. And this actually happened. His diary is true. He wrote a diary. He wrote very graphically about his sexual rapes of his slaves. And the diary was kept by his family until 1900, and then given to the University of South Carolina. And then the university gave it to, allowed it to be published in 1950. And oddly enough, nobody wrote about it, nobody mentioned it, nobody did anything with the knowledge that it had until 2010, when the woman who is the head of Harvard, Dreyfuss,
Do
she
you
wrote
think
a
that
book.
that's because it was incredibly graphic in nature, and that excerpt is very dramatic, and I think that maybe that was a tough pill to swallow. I think as far as slavery, people imagined, slaves in the fields and things like that. I don't think that they automatically go to the slaves as
Right.
Being raped and as sexual property as well as property to be able to work in the fields and things like that.
Well, what I loved is Richard has such a cool, different perspective on the Civil War and stories that I've never heard before. And when he got to see Professor Dave speaking, he just goes, "How do I meet this guy? I got to be with him." So this is why we're here. So it's great for you guys to dig into all this and have fun.
It really is, because when I've never heard that either. That was my first exposure. And
Sure,
I have a lot of feelings about it as I think about it, but a lot of things struck me about it, and it gets back to your question, Layne, which is, why would this not be known or not? Part of it is known. It was known certainly by enslaved people that this thing happened, but they didn't have a written record somewhere in a library. A lot of abolitionists, part of the critique of slavery was that it did give this corrupting absolute power to the slave owners. And what I like about this scene is that and you're connecting it then to the King Cotton speech, is that it connects all of these elements of the slave system. We're talking about real people. You're talking about dirty, difficult, nasty things. You're talking about economies. You're talking about wealth. Slavery, the Southern slavery was producing 2/3 of the world's cotton by the 1850s. The slave system, all together, if you added up the property value, the labor value, the land, the cash, everything, was greater than the industry of the North. This just wasn't a few people with a few slaves. This was the bedrock of not just the Southern economy and society, but the American, and in many ways the Western world.
There was more millionaires in the South than there were collectively throughout the states at that time.
And so when you realize just how important this is for the Southern system, but then also at the individual level, the way they would corrupt a slave owner, right? That you could, to get your head around this idea of owning someone with who has no recourse. They are legally your property, right? And to do with as you want, and that oftentimes led to horrible things. That to me, that's a powerful reading that rips us right away from this idea of the ideal South and Gone with the Wind and plantations and everything's great. It's because it's clearly not.
And then skipping ahead 250 years, which you have that version of the story you always talk that's really just Act 1. Okay, everybody's free. Lincoln gets shot, and there was so much more that needed to happen.
See, here's the thing. History is, on one level, a story told in a completely inhumane way. I don't mean inhumane being vicious and ugly, but they talk about it as, well, we had so many thousands of men on one side and then thousands of men on another, and then these thousands of men met in battle and these thousands of men died. But let's talk about Len and Fred. Let's talk about Huck and Tom. Because Tom and Huck actually narrate this show of mine. And it's the treetop level. It's God's look at this stuff from the close-up personal reality. It's not just armies meeting in famous places.
Yeah, you're getting in on a micro
Right.
level,
Yeah.
very specific story.
Right, and you're getting a story, for instance, that is not only horrible on its own, but when you realize these two men, Hammond really was the richest man in the South. Hammond really was a rapist, and it wasn't even to him rape. It was simply his property had to do whatever he said, and they did. And they did it in front of the wives. This all happened in front of the purity of the Southern women. And that was the story that had to be told at the end of the war, or else why didn't the women just take up guns and shoot their husbands? Because they had been trained in a system that called for the purity of the Southern woman and the brainlessness, because they were not allowed to learn anything.
Right.
And they would sit on their porches and they would be given a glass of tea
The big dresses.
by a young black girl who 20 minutes before had been in a sexual escapade with that woman's husband and accomplished right in front of her.
So the women didn't even look away. They were fully aware of what was going on.
And they all tried to look away and pretend that it wasn't happening.
But there's a scholarship now that looks at exactly that sort of dichotomy. It says, what are women's complicity in the slave system? And they're there. You're right. The myth is they're just these innocent sort of bystanders that are just sort of complete. But no, they're aware. They're mistresses. They're engaged and involved. And I like this idea of getting down to the micro level, because I don't normally quote Joseph Stalin, but when I do, he said something to the effect of, 1 million deaths is a statistic, but one is a tragedy. And it's the same thing with something like the Civil War or with slavery. You can give all these statistics, 4 million enslaved people, this many dollars, but when you're talking about a person, this is Frederick. What was Frederick's life like? All of a sudden it becomes human, because we're talking about people. And so to take it down to that human level, you can still have big themes and you can still have meaningful interpretations, but it humanizes the history. So I agree with you that this tendency to sort of talk too much big picture loses that.
Right.
And we need to be reminded that these are people making choices, difficult choices, unthinking choices, and not equal power dynamics, and they're all sort of navigating this and trying to survive. And
this man's
it's
wife,
messy.
Catherine, had to behave as if it wasn't happening, as if, because Hammond himself was a beast, and he didn't care, so that she had to not see it. And that's what the Southern women had to do. The Southern white women had to pretend that they didn't see it.
Well, even during your guys' last show, you talked about bringing in prostitutes, which I had never heard of before, because like Richard and I were talking about that exact same thing, and it used to be that was part of the thing that you would plummet. You get the gold and the women, and you rape everyone in the village. But in America, we said, no, we're not doing that to our wives. We're not doing that to our people. So they brought in, like you said, prostitutes. So I never heard of anything.
Yeah, and this also then becomes sort of part of the white Southern ethos that Sherman, that's raping and pillaging and defiling our women, as if that wasn't happening already in and amongst themselves. But you're right. There had been a system of prostitution that existed in most American cities, a red light district, and when the soldiers showed up, that then became a location. And we talked about in Memphis in the last one, where the Union Army had been there for so long, women began coming on their own, and then the Army facilitated it, and then began regulating it to prevent disease and those sorts of things. And so it became this sort of regulated, formalized system of prostitution. And we know a lot, but we don't know everything. What does that mean then in terms of how soldiers behave towards the civilian population? Is it a better system, and what does it mean for women? I mean, there's a lot of questions it raises. But yes, that is absolutely a part of what's happening in soldiers' camps during the war.
Richard, I have a question. So did Hammond have children, and were they aware of what was going on at this time?
I don't know whether they were aware at the time, but the family, as a family, had the diaries after Hammond died, and they gave it to the university. I would imagine that they did know, although it's quite possible that Catherine Hammond didn't let anyone know about those diaries.
And so this is just one example of Hammond writing in a diary and a piece of history that we have access to now. But think about how many people found diaries like that and burned them. Like,
well,
I don't want this history to be known.
There's a very...
it's like clearing your hard drive today.
Exactly, yeah. Clearing the history, right?
There's a very important part of the study of the Civil War, which is the attitudes people have about Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee was a very good general. He was a very good general on the defensive. He worked better when he was being attacked as opposed to him being on the offensive. And he was very good and very well respected. He was not the marble man. He was not yet, during his lifetime, he was not a god. That occurred when he died. And it occurred because two Civil War generals under Lee had made two terrible mistakes. And they wanted to recoup their own reputations. And they took over the Southern Military Review. And they wrote so much and had others writing so much that actually, for the first time, the cliche that we always hear about war, where they say the winners write history, this is the one breach. Because in this case, the winners didn't write it; the losers wrote it, and they had to write so that their own reputations were saved. In order to do that, they had to make Lee a god, and in order to make Lee a god, they had to find a villain who had screwed up, and so they just named another general, Longstreet. And this all happened in the years after the war, which were about as, when it comes to talking about the Civil War, this is an era of such senselessness and goofy craziness. Goofy. Jefferson Davis, who lived somehow forever, wrote lots of things about the war, and he kept saying after the war, this war was not about slavery. What are you talking about? This was about tariffs.
It's about money. It's about cost.
Yeah.
Right.
And he was a liar because this war was about slavery, and he said so before the war.
Right.
And he said it and said it and said it and said it a lot. And his vice president said it and said it and said it. And every single state that seceded because of slavery. Mm-hmm. And then they all said, slavery? What slavery? Oh, you mean the thing with the black? Oh, they loved it. And they drew this picture of the black people loving being slaves.
Room and board.
And so I had a scene in this thing where the young girl is giving the tea to her mistress. And at the same time, there is an auction, a slave auction going on, and her child is sold away. Because as part of the slave economic structure, they wanted to separate families as soon as possible so that there was nothing for them. In terms of family, they didn't have that to anchor themselves. So the children were sold away, wives were sold away, And so we have in this story of mine, this young girl is pouring the tea very daintily, and then the next moment she is shrieking in horror and running off the patio, off the front, and screaming insanely, my baby, my baby. And she's trying to keep the slave owners from selling her child to California. And because she did that, she's whipped. Now, there were certain things that were only done in terms of slavery. Certain punishments that only were given to slaves. And I will tell you one story. When Robert E. Lee, who was known as the coming man, he was worshipped by his own boss and had been a hero in the Mexican War. When he came back to Washington, slightly earlier than expected, because he was the man in charge of his wife's uncle's will. His wife's uncle was named Washington, and he was the great something of George Washington. And Martha, Robert's wife, was a direct descendant. And that meant that she really was a princess in the Southern aristocracy. Mm-hmm. Custis Washington had made a mess of his will. And he had said, among other things, that on his death all slaves of his were to be freed. So Robert E. Lee was brought back early to take care of the will. And he found out that 3 of the slaves owned by Custis had taken Custis at his word. On his death, they were free. So 3 of them walked. They just left. All right? And Robert E. Lee, the famous, wonderful general, sent men after them. He used the famous fugitive slave law, and he sent men and dogs after 2 men and a woman, and he had them dragged back to the home of Custis, which he willed to Robert's wife, and therefore willed it to Robert, was a mansion called Arlington. And that mansion sits on the edge of the line between Virginia and D.C., the district. It is fabulous. It is incredible. And it faces the Capitol. It's the most famous private home in that whole area. And it now belonged to Robert E. Lee. So that it was at Arlington that these slaves were brought home. And for whatever reason, Robert, who had spent his life in the military and had never really had an opinion about slavery that anyone knew about, decided that it was his own personal obligation to punish not all of the 3. Other peoples whipped the men, but Robert whipped the woman. Robert E. Lee whipped the back of this young girl who had just walked away because the law said she could. And unbeknownst to most people, the Lee family was as riven with pro-union, anti-union feeling as every other family. And his Robert's wife and Robert's daughter were pro-union. And Robert's sister, Anne, was pro-union. And I have a scene in here, which is it's a family dinner, which just becomes chaos because Anne says, I don't recognize the man who did that. That's not who you were. And Robert said, well, I had to keep order. And she says, you didn't have to whip her. That's the slave thing. That's only done to slaves. Why did you whip her? That's the man I don't recognize. And she says to Robert E. Lee, if you make the decision I think you're going to make, I will never talk to you again.
Good for her.
And she kept the promise, which, by the way, was the same promise made by many women.
Right.
George Thomas's sisters, who he saved that day in front of Nat Turner. They turned George's picture to the wall and never spoke of him again because he stayed with the Union.
I'd love for you to jump into that whole thing about what would have, could have, should have happened if Lincoln would have had another term, that what you call ending slavery, just Act One. I'd love to hear your guys' opinion on that because it's interesting.
Well, we're going to get into this for sure. We have lots to talk about with this idea. I was going to say the rest of the story, of course, with Arlington is that I guess it ultimately does end up in Union hands because during the war, the Union seizes that land, and the Quartermaster General Meigs, his son dies, and he is so angry that Lee has killed his son in war that he decides to confiscate that land and turn it into a national cemetery for soldiers, which of course becomes Arlington National Cemetery.
Right.
So the ultimate irony is that land then does become the final resting place for American soldiers, and it becomes the site actually of a freedom camp when the slaves are running away by the hundreds of thousands during the war. And my students ask me, well, gee, why does that happen all of a sudden in the 1860s? I say, well, first of all, they are running away, but the law's not on their side. Before the war, they get brought back because of the fugitive slave law, and they get whipped, right? When the war's happening, it's possible, right? Everything's disrupted. The United States isn't enforcing this fugitive slave law anymore, and they're able to come to these freedom camps. And so you have hundreds of thousands who run away. And getting to your question, and this is exactly what you write about, so I'm interested to hear your thoughts too, is oftentimes we talk about the Civil War as if that's the end of the story, right? There's slavery, there's a war, and then that's it. and we
ends, everybody's free.
That's right.
Well,
and there's this great scene in The Family Guy where it's the best representation I've ever seen of this. It's a long story. I don't go into all the background, but basically there's a moment where the wife yells and she says, "All right, I'm sorry. I'm just a little bit of tension in this house since the FCC arrived." And Brian the dog says to her, "A little tension. There's more tension in this house than when the slaves were freed." And then they do one of their flashbacks, and it's a slave owner and an enslaved person. And the slave owner undoes the shackles and says, "So you're free to go, and we're cool, right?" And then it flashes back. Right. And I show that to my students because that moment is the essence of what you're going to get at, which is it's not all cool. It's not all just over. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of questions that now have to be answered. So the Civil War answers two important questions. Will there be a United States? Yes. Will it have slavery? No. Every other question is on the table. Right? What's their status? What's citizenship? Who does the work? For whom? And that's what you suppose, how does it play out with Reconstruction? What might have been different if some other things had happened?
Yeah, I think that we come to a war, and that war was inevitable
not from 1857 and not from 1850. It was an inevitability from the time of Jefferson and Hamilton.
We have 1,600 slaves started coming to the United States.
16, maybe?
Yes, and they knew that there had to be a reckoning. Okay, and the reckoning could have been peaceful. It could have been many, many, many things if they had taken their heads out of their ostrich-like holes in the ground. The Southerners had an ability to deny reality, which is matched only by the current American public society, and we are the champions of denial. But the Southerners will run us a very close second. Most people don't realize that every president from George Washington until Lincoln were slave-owning men. Every one of them, except for John Quincy Adams, who was a constitutionalist and would not, he like Lincoln said, I can't do anything that the Constitution wouldn't let me. So both of them were against slavery being enlarged in the territories, but where it was sacrosanct, because it was in the Constitution. But that meant every single president from George Washington on.
And it started at a dinner that I think is one of the great stories of all time. When the United States was formed after the Constitutional Convention had created a country, Hamilton, who was probably the smartest of all of them, said that the central government, the new central government, had to pay the war debts of the War of Independence of all of the states. Whatever states now turned into states in the United States, their war debt had to be paid by the central government, or the banks in Europe would not accept us as a real country. It would be it's a fake, and the banks had made it very clear they're not lending us or dealing with us at all until we know that you're really there and you're going to stay there. And they needed a gesture, and that gesture was the central government taking all of the war debts of each of the separate colonies into states. And everyone agreed. All the colonies into states agreed. All of the states agreed that the central government should pay the war debt, except for one state. And that was a pretty important state, Virginia. And the governor of Virginia, who made this decision, and who knew that he had the United States of America tottering on existence or non-existence, was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, who is considered by some a hero and others a snake. And he is pretty much of a heroic snake, and probably the worst snaky member of his generation. And he's one of the few Americans who I actually proudly despise, because he's the most snaky. That's the only word that fits him. But Jefferson was holding up the United States, and he had a personal hatred of Hamilton, which was returned by Hamilton to Jefferson very, very intensely. And these two enemies found themselves on a street one night, facing one another, bumped into one another, and Jefferson says, "Why don't you come home to dinner with me tonight?" Hamilton, and we'll work out this problem. And Hamilton said, okay. And they went to Jefferson's home, and the only other person there was James Madison, and Madison was known forever for holding Jefferson's coat. That was his function in life, was to hold Jefferson's coat. And they had dinner, which was Madeira and duck and all that. And Hamilton just waited. And finally Jefferson said, I have a solution to your problem. We will allow you to pay the war debt, and there you'll have your country. And I only ask for one tiny little thing. And I can just imagine being in that room at that moment with Hamilton, not knowing what it was going to be, but he knew it was going to be a tough one. Jefferson said, I just want one tiny little thing. And what is that? Hamilton said. And Jefferson replied, I want the capital of the new United States to be in Virginia. And Hamilton knew exactly what that would mean, and he was in a corner, and he agreed. He had to. And why was it important? What was the big deal about keeping Washington, the capital, in Virginia? Well, it was because that meant that the federal government would be staffed by slavers only forever, until there was a civil war, in this case, 60 years. Every single agency, every single bureaucrat, every single department was staffed by slavers, which meant that the government of the United States had a lean toward slavery and slavers. So that it didn't shock anyone that the Supreme Court would allow such decisions as the Dred Scott decision, which not only said that, yes, slavery is legal, it said very particularly, not only is slavery legal in America, it is more legal. It's meant for only black people, no one else, which had never been said or legally named. No one had ever done that until the Dred Scott decision. And they said in the Dred Scott decision that a free black in Massachusetts, if seized by the fugitive slave people and brought back to the South, he was a slave,
Right.
no matter what.
Right.
And it declared that same free black person a non-citizen, and it overturned the Missouri Compromise,
Right.
which then allowed for all those listeners out there who haven't brushed up on their Missouri Compromise recently. The Missouri Compromise was again a settlement, a compromise designed to settle this question of would there be an expansion of slavery, which of course had been troublesome and was held sacrosanct. And the Supreme Court in Dred Scott said, no, the federal government, Congress, did not have the constitutional authority to ban slavery from expanding because, of course, they're property, and no American be denied their right to carry their property. And what that did is it opened the West to the expansion of slavery. And so to take it back to that dinner, these are really one and the same thing, because what's at stake isn't slavery where it exists, which most folks were willing to allow to happen. It's a state thing. This was about where slavery could go, and therefore where the United States was going to go. So Jefferson isn't just setting it up for himself in Virginia, he's setting it up for the nation to then be a slaveholding nation. And Dred Scott case is setting it up for a future direction
Right.
of slavery.
And what was not being admitted was that slavery was one of those economic things that destroyed the land on which it was, and it constantly needed new land. It has to do with the importance of cotton, and no one had known that cotton would become that important.
Right.
And only slaves, because of the sun, they said, could do this particular work.
It was pretty racist.
It was really, it was the first time that anyone ever said that white people wouldn't do that work. Astounding.
So I have a question about that too, and also maybe a misconception that the people of the North weren't slave owners, and that
Yeah.
everybody just thinks that everyone from the North, the Yankees, that they weren't slave owners. Nobody worked in
Right.
in the homes or anything like that. But it was still very relevant in the North as well. There just happened to be more people.
Well, they happen to believe the Northerners were, of course, virgins. They were new virgins. They had come upon their own absolute innocence sometime in the 1840s and decided that only those people in the South were guilty of slavery, when in fact the northern ships brought slaves
Right.
to
Exactly.
America,
Yeah.
and great family wealth
Right.
famous family wealth was created in the North.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The banks that were rolling, the investments and the money. Now, the states of the North had by then abolished slavery gradually on their own after the Revolution, but it was all still very gradual, and there were still people who were enslaved in the North because they had to live out their life or their term or whatever. So it was all, yeah, I mean, it wasn't this pure Northern group. And then you get into the issue of racism. It's not like Northerners weren't thinking in racial terms. So yeah, Northerners were certainly not.
It was one of
in
the
any
most
way innocent.
difficult things that Southerners found themselves being patronized by Northerners because they had finished making their money in the shipping business, and the Southern economy had achieved what is known as the impossible.
Put this behind your back.
Oh.
And
You're being directed by Stella.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, Stella.
and the where was I? The Southern economy was being told that the Northerners had nothing to do with slavery, and of course that was not only untrue; it was impossible to achieve without Northern ships. And then the Northerners, the Southerners had achieved the impossible, which was a slave economy which did not any longer need African slaves. It was, they had achieved a birth rate
Right.
of slaves, so that they actually had enough slaves within their own slave situation to constantly feed their need for slaves. Unlike Brazil, unlike Cuba and the other areas that still needed to get African slaves. So that when the British decided they were going to stop the international slave trade, to the American South, their attitude was, oh, too bad, because they had achieved the perfection.
Yeah. So
Right.
so 1808 they banned it. I was thinking something that, and this is something actually that oftentimes shocks my students. When you look at the millions of Africans brought by Europeans through the Triangle trade to, as you point out, Brazil, the Caribbean, it's millions. The number that arrived in British North America is about only 500,000, 500,000. By 1860, there were 4 million enslaved people in the United States. So you're right, they had achieved this sort of, and what that means though is what happens in the United States is an internal slave trade network. So as you talk about the splitting up of families and the selling and the commodities and the economics, a lot of the money made during slavery wasn't so much in the labor of the slave, but in the buying and selling and trading of slaves.
And growing the families
Right.
of the
You
slaves
don't
as well.
you don't get slavery in Texas without bringing people from Georgia. You don't get slavery in Arkansas without forcefully. So
Right.
we think of expansion in the American West, and we picture the wagon trains. Don't forget there were slaves behind them.
Yeah.
One thing I was going to say about Northerners, because this is something that it is a big misconception. I know that was one of the questions some listeners had. What a big conception. The number of radical. Well, let me put it this way. During the Revolution, there's a brief moment where there are some Americans who recognize that slavery is incompatible with American freedom. They see the hypocrisy, they see the paradox. There were a lot of religious people who saw that, like Quakers. But it's really not until 1830 that you get a sizable number of white, mostly Northerners, but not all, who had a moral revulsion to slavery. And those are known as the radical abolitionists. But it's still a very small number. People estimate, was it 2% of the population, 5%? It's still very small. That doesn't get Abraham Lincoln elected. You need 5-10% of the population. So what explains how you could have a general anti-slavery movement if you still have people tied to slavery, if they're still racist, if they're certainly not radical? And the answer is, back to expansion. White Northern workers opposed slavery insofar as it affected their bottom line, right? If slavery expands west, that land becomes occupied by new cash crops. That land is not available for the average white male worker who wants to escape wage labor, move out west. So the conflict comes in Western expansion. And so a Northern wage worker would say, I oppose slavery and its expansion not because I care about the humanity of the enslaved person, not because I'm a radical, not because it conflicts with my Christian faith, but because its expansion threatens my opportunity. And that it is and that way it is opposed to the values that I have as a wage earner. And so they could critique it through their own economic framework. Anyway, which is all going a long ways to say is there were Northerners who were generally opposed to slavery, but still white supremacists, still racists.
Right.
And were very moderate in that position. And so anyway, so Lincoln gets elected. We can talk more about the Civil War and what happens after because we got lots of time. But I think that's an important point about the North. The North is not this angelic, all anti-slavery, all woke, all enlightened at all.
Can I also ask you about Native Americans during that time? And I know that they were enslaved to a point, and were they sort of off the hook, so to speak, at some point when the slaves really came over and all the cash crops and the cotton and the tobacco and stuff? What were the Native Americans doing at this time? I know that we had already driven them off the lands that they were in and given them certain areas to kind of hang out in, but I know that they were certainly enslaved too at some point.
Well, they weren't part of the slave machinery for a couple of reasons. First of all, they weren't black, and that has a bigotry all of its own. Second, they were at that moment right on the tipping point between being sovereign, in a sense, sovereign powers that we were killing, and being so wrecked by our treatment that they were worthless when it came to work. And they didn't want any part of America. They still thought of America or the land as they didn't want any part of these newcomers. They were still
Indians didn't believe that you can even own land.
Yeah, right.
It shouldn't be owned. It's
Right.
not part of something.
And
Certainly, not
that's-
private property.
And that's actually, it's always discussed or held up as a kind of spiritual reality. And it's true, it is, in a sense, a spiritual victory for the Indians. But don't forget that, if we had never touched North America, the Indians would have been fighting amongst themselves just like everyone else.
Yeah, no, in fact, that's when European colonists first arrive, of course there are Native Americans already here, and you're right, they have their alliances and they have their They're long-standing historic antagonisms, and so they become another player in this European game. The English are fighting the French, who are fighting the Dutch, who are fighting the Iroquois, and everyone's sort of mixed up. And what happens at first is there's a mixed labor system in the colonies. You have land, you have products, you need someone to do the work. And so the question is, who's going to do that? And so, of course, in some circumstances, it's Native Americans, but the problem is they're fighting, they can escape, a lot of them have disease and die. You can try African slaves, but the mortality rate is so high that it doesn't make sense economically. And then they're indentured servants. And so you have this mixed labor system, and then over time, it becomes consolidated to African slavery, which then becomes the permanent hereditary racial form that we know now by about the 1650s. But by that point, Native Americans essentially have been pushed back away. And where it comes to a head again is every time colonists want to go further west and hit that frontier line. And so, of course, the English tell them, don't go further west. It's costing us money. We have to send troops and forts. But of course, Americans do. And then when Americans start expanding in the 1800s, the same thing happens again. So since George Washington, the natives had been treated essentially as sovereign nations. And so when the state of Georgia attempted to distribute land of the Cherokee to white farmers, the Cherokee took them to court and said, you can't do that. You don't, and the Supreme Court in Worcester versus Georgia agreed with the Cherokee and said, you're a sovereign nation, you deal with the federal government, the state of Georgia doesn't have the authority. And what did Andrew Jackson say? Of course, you're the federal government. No, Andrew Jackson said, they made their decision, let them enforce it. Andrew Jackson, of course, then continues with the Indian Removal Act, sends down the federal troops, and forcefully removes the Cherokee. So it does connect to slavery because they're part of that mixed group who are sort of where, as colonists sort of figuring out who's going to do the labor. And then later, it's their land that slavery is going to be brought into by white settlers. So they're very much tied to the system. There are a few who then work within the system as slave traders or as trackers. But for the most part, and this is how I explain it to my students, white people have an economic relationship with non-white people. So for blacks, you're a slave, you're a commodity, and the law treats you as such. For Native Americans, you're a hindrance, you're a barrier, you're an obstacle to my economic interest, and therefore you get removed or killed. There's no need to whip and discipline a Native American. You're not trying to get them to work for you. You just kill them and push them out of the way. And so I think it comes down to that economic calculus. And if you want, we can talk about Native Americans in the Civil War too, because that's a whole other fascinating thing.
But there is a story.
Yeah.
There is a story that is at the basis of this, which is a story about Washington and another man that shows what could have been, and it shows a real gallantry and heroism on the part of two white men, and they were Henry Knox. Mm-hmm. Henry Knox had been Washington's artillery chief during the War of Independence, and he had learned. He started out as a bookseller, and he became this really, really talented artillery chief. And when Washington started in to be president, Knox came to him and said, if we're not careful, we're going to slaughter these people. We're going to have a genocide. And we don't want that. And one of the reasons that Knox knew how Washington felt about all this is that Washington had spent his youth as a land what do they call surveyor. Mm-hmm. And because he was dealing for a good 20 years with the surveying of the physical land of the colonies at the time, he came to know the inhabitants of North America faster and more completely than anybody else. Which meant, as a man of his time, he was very farsightful. As a man of his time, he also scalped a lot of people he shouldn't have.
But he did. And there's an argument to be made that George Washington is actually named Forrest Gump. He's
Everywhere.
He's always there. He's always everywhere
Uh-huh.
in American early history. And
that's really funny. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's true. He kind of is.
Yeah.
And he lives a sort of charmed life where these things happen, where you think, how's he getting away with this?
in the French and Indian War began because an English, a man from the English army met with his French enemy, and each side brought their Indian allies to this meeting. And something happened at that meeting which pissed off the American young lieutenant, and they scalped everybody. The Americans did it, they started it, and they killed the French and their Indian allies and scalped them. Scalping was not an Indian thing. It was actually brought to them by us.
Really?
I don't know why we call us. I don't know why even I say it.
I wasn't there, but we've certainly inherited the tradition.
I wasn't there.
Yeah. Somehow, even I do this without thinking. I put myself in the shoes of the Europeans that came to North America, and I just finished reading a book called "The Peopling of British North America," and in that book, they talk about Washington and what he said, what he thought was different than anyone else. First of all, he knew that in the establishment of the colony of Virginia, Virginia started on the Atlantic, and then it moved westward, and it had no ending in the original, mapping.
Claim, right.
Right.
Yeah.
It had no ending, which meant that you could argue that Virginia went all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And Washington got to know the Indians, the Indians that were the inhabitants of these places. And Knox also. And so, after the terrible incident that started the French and Indian War, which is also known as the First World War by some, because it was fought all over the world between the French and the English. It was only partly in the frontier in America, but it was in Tahiti also. And when it was over, the English government said to the Americans, "We want you to pay the taxes for the war." And the Americans said, "Well, excuse me, sir, we've paid with our own blood."
Right.
And no one else did that. And they basically said, "Why don't you ask the House of Lords to pay for some of this instead of their horse racing? Why don't you ask those who just sit around and suck up our blood and our lives?" And they refused to pay. Ultimately, this became the thing that caused the War of Independence. And that war was basically fought because the Americans realized that they were here and the English government was there, and if the English government was really going to try to tell them how to live, let them try it. They couldn't. They knew something that the government didn't, and that was that they were there, and to get there.
Yeah, and what upset, we're off the Civil War now, but it all connects. You see, it's the settlement, the French and Indian War leads to the Revolution, die is cast, eventually gets us to the Civil War. But the attempt then that the British made, they realized, wow, you're right, you are there and we are here. How can we have control? We're going to tax you and we're going to use those taxes to pay, this is the exciting part, to pay the salaries of the colonial magistrates and judges. So on its surface, it doesn't seem like such a bad deal, right? We pay taxes, those go to pay for our civil servants. But the colonies themselves had levied those taxes. Now Parliament was going to do it. And so Parliament now is giving the money to the colonial magistrates and the governors, would basically put them into the back pocket of Parliament. And so that was how they were able to kind of stretch their arm across the Atlantic and get some control. And that's exactly when the colonists said, well, wait a second, it's no taxation without our own representation. If we don't have a voice in Parliament, how can you possibly do that?
But also there was a thing that no one mentions, which is that up until this point, Massachusetts had as much to do or care about Georgia as a flitting flea.
Right.
They had nothing to do with each other. And they had no reason to know or like each other.
Right.
So that what the king did by kind of mishandling this was to bring the colonies together. Massachusetts writes a letter to Georgia and says, are you as pissed off about this as I am? Because we're really pissed off. And they said, yeah, we too. And they formed a Continental Congress. That was the first mistake.
Just think how long that conversation took. You say write a letter. It's not like an email.
That's
Somebody
true.
had to
That
get
is
there.
true. They
Right.
did say, well, we'll wait and
No.
get the response and we'll see what
Right,
happens.
right.
In the meantime, there's an attack. But
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
took 3
OG.
weeks to
that's
come
right.
back.
But it
and
is
forth,
absolutely true, is that we think of the revolution as, well, one day, Paul Revere woke up and wrote around. No, it was a process. Say, okay, well, if they're going to impose a stamp tax or they're going to impose the Townsend Act or whatever it is, how are we going to respond to this? Well, we're going to respond by boycotting. Well, the only way a boycott works is if you all do it together. Well, if Georgia is doing one thing and Massachusetts is doing it, it doesn't work. So you get the Continental Congress so that everyone's on the same page, and that creates a unity that, yeah, you're right, probably wasn't there
And-
beforehand.
And what is unseen, unknown, unrealized until the peace is signed is this. The British took for granted that there were 13 powers in North America without any need to ally themselves with one another. And those 13 colonies had 13 different ambitions, and they would fight amongst themselves, and they would head westward, as everyone knew, but not necessarily as one power, but as 13. And 13 powers, as far as the British understood it, was far better for the British. 13 separate powers and their Indian problems, and in a stroke of a pen, they had created one power. They had created one nation in North America with a brutal ambition and a tough, intellectual, and smart population.
Let me stop you right there for a second. So we just hit our hour mark, and I want to just reintroduce everybody. So I have Ron Blackburn, Richard Dreyfuss, and Professor David Miller here. We're talking about the Civil War and what led up to the Civil War and what's a montage of everything. So we're here through the Quarantine Network on Facebook Live. Also, we have an Instagram feed going as well this afternoon, and we're recording elsewise, to put something together later on, maybe to put up on YouTube or something like that, so people can check back in later on. So I just wanted to thank all of my guests for being here this afternoon. And
Do we want to take questions? Have there been questions that...
One question we had was, is it true that the word hooker comes from the Civil War?
Yes.
I feel like Richard is a great person to ask about that. For some reason, I think he's going to know the answer. Yeah.
Yes, there was a general named Hooker, and he was a talented general, and
Fighting Joe.
he was, unfortunately, he thought of himself as being a pretty good guy. He thought too much of himself. But he was a very good general. He also had a sense of allowance. He felt that his men, in order to keep them from raping women, believed that prostitutes had a place. And so his attitude toward prostitution as a system, which he looked at favorably, was turned into, by his enemies, that he was, he loved prostitutes. And that's how they got the name hookers, because his name was Hooker.
Wow. So he was sort of the ruler of the prostitutes, and the prostitutes were then hookers? Or he was
if you're suggesting that General Hooker was a pimp, that is not
was
entirely accurate.
Okay, not him.
It's that he did understand the soldiers needed prostitutes.
When we go back to what we were talking about as far as the legality behind it and
Right.
making sure
Exactly.
that
And I
they're
think that
clean
it's-
prostitutes as
Right.
as opposed to one
As opposed
syphilis
to shunning it and saying this is immoral and indecent, and we're going to just pretend it's not here, when in fact, of course, it's going to be there. He just sort of
was an
yeah.
advocate.
And
Yeah, allowed
he
it
made
to
the
happen,
mistake of bragging so much about his own abilities that he had no allies. He had no one who was in his corner, and when he lost a battle, there was no one there among the heads of the Union Army or the government that liked him enough to fight for him.
Yeah.
And so he was actually meant to be the general at Gettysburg. It really was his army, but he was taken off the head of the army because what was the name?
Chancellorsville.
Chancellorsville.
Yep.
When he lost Chancellorsville, Hooker, he had created a pretty damn good strategy for this battle, and he should have won it. Not only it wasn't his frailties in a sense that lost the battle; it was the fact that Lee's lieutenant, Stonewall Jackson, was able to do things that nobody expected him to able to do, and he beat Hooker in a way that surprised everyone. And it was really more about how Stonewall Jackson was brilliant than it was about Hooker being stupid. Hooker wasn't stupid, but circumstances were that he was just overthought by Jackson.
And of course, Jackson eventually then gets shot by his own men. And to this day, as you're driving up the old freeway there in Virginia, past Chancellorsville, there's a shrine where Jackson has his arm amputated. He then goes behind the lines and ends up contracting the disease and dying. But there's a shrine actually there where he's shot.
Can we talk about the death and dying, I guess, too, of the Civil War? And now we're up to 700,000 lives lost at that time, and that'd be like losing it was like 2% of the population.
My understanding is the only war with a higher percentage of the population is the Revolution. But we can talk about it. There's it's sort of counter to what we were talking about before about we can give these big statistics. But I think that this actually this makes a point. The numbers are astounding, right? 700,000, 650,000, 700,000, 750,000, depending on sort of whose numbers you're using. Mm-hmm. Probably 50,000 civilians. Destruction that the United States has never seen before. Greater than all wars combined. Right. More Americans died in a single day at Antietam than died at Pearl Harbor or D-Day, anything. That shocks us now, and it was equally shocking to Americans in 1863 or 1864. And just as today, Richard, you're suggesting that to make sense of this and to humanize it, we have to look at the individual, so too did popular culture in the Civil War at the time. And so what we see is, there's a great book by Alice Foss about Northern popular. She talks about Southern popular culture as well, but more Northern. And there's this attempt in magazines, songs, print, to take away the mass anonymity and the statistics of death and to make it individual and personal. And so there's a focus on the individual experience as, again, a way to humanize and reconnect people to what is otherwise just sort of just an overwhelming and dizzying set of statistics.
And even in a point to that, so the photography as we know it was maybe only 20, 30 years old at this point, and some of our, the men who went to war. So back then you died in your house, you died around your family, it was this whole send-off. And now all of a sudden you have thousands and thousands of people that are dying on the field at the time. And so, there are stories of even now to our vets bringing, photos of their loved ones around them, and they're writing, on the battlefield as they're dying. Sometimes it doesn't even finish, the rest of the sentence, and they have their pictures of their mothers and children and whoever are all around them. So I think that that's an interesting perspective as well. The other part too is, so you think that in some of these where you have even 400, 500, thousands of people that died at the time, they didn't really have a proper way to bury these bodies or to take them off, or what do they do with them at this point? They're just bloated and dying and oozing and rotting, just out there. And I know even after Gettysburg, they ended up digging up a lot of those bodies and reburying them at the National Cemetery, and I think that was the first national cemetery that was created. We didn't have national cemeteries.
Right. And I want to say a very important part about that too, and this is going to upset any Southern listeners. It's all Northern. I'm just kidding. From San Diego. It's Union soldiers that are buried at Gettysburg. There is a separate section where a few unidentified Confederates were left and buried, basically dug up and put there. And people forget that. And again, it gets back to what we were talking about, how after the war there was this deification of Lee, and it wasn't about slavery, and it's romanticized. The reality is that during the war, the Union didn't think of Confederates as they're the enemy. Right. And Lincoln didn't go to Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery to all of the soldiers who died there, right? He dedicated it to, he's talking specifically in the Gettysburg Address about the Union soldiers who died to advance freedom. So I'm always struck by that. I saw just this last Memorial Day, I saw a tweet with the Confederate flag, sort of, honoring all who died in the war, and I'm thinking that's certainly a change, because that's not how people at the time were thinking about it.
I think, though, that is one of the deceptions that Lincoln was using at that speech. I think that he knew that
there's not only 700,000 men. There's a feeling, a passion, a hatred that is so intense that Europe looked at that war in awe. They'd never seen a war so savagely fought. And at the same time, there were soldiers on both sides who played baseball with one another during the war. It was the love and hate of family. It's a war that is such a tragedy because it's a glorious aspect of family emotions, and to say that brothers fought brothers is not even to begin, because fathers fought sons, and the sons fought grandfathers.
In the last hour, we ended with not ended, but we talked about freeing slavery was really just the end of Act One, right? And if Lincoln hadn't been killed, what would happen? It'd be nice if we could somehow tie it with the problems we have today and what we should have done and the problems we're still reeling from. I mean, we went 100 years where it was perfectly okay to lynch a black person on the side of the road.
See, we missed here's what we missed. We didn't know at the time anything about what is it, PTS syndrome?
PTSD.
PTSD? Okay. We didn't know that. We didn't have a science about it. We knew in a human way that soldiers came back different, that Uncle Sol came back different, But they didn't know that this was a trauma, that this was a wound, like the Vietnam War was a wound. and we were beginning to understand about this syndrome from Vietnam. If we had known then that this was a trauma to the soul of America, then we might have been capable of doing things that were unthinkable at any other time. And what I'm talking about is actually solving the race problem. You know, the race problem, the race in America is impossible to solve. It will never be solved.
It reminds me of Alexis de Tocqueville, that quote about America.
Yeah.
which I love.
America is the only country, de Tocqueville said this, it's the only country that is bound only by ideas. It has no common religion, no common caste or class, no common bloodline that everyone is devoted to because of divine right. There's no common anything except the ideas of the Enlightenment. And if these ideas are not taught to each separate generation, they're not bound. That's the quote.
Which is exactly the reason for your book of we've stopped teaching civics, 50 years ago? 40, 50 years ago?
Right.
And nobody,
We stopped without realizing it, teaching the binding of America, so that we just have floated away from each other, and we don't know why that sector of the country is responding the way it is, and we don't know why we don't like each other, and we don't know why we don't know enough not to hate one another. And we were taught in what was called civics how to speak to one another civilly. And if you don't get it taught to you, you're not going to discover it by yourself.
Right.
It's not like it sits there waiting to be discovered. It's something you have to be taught.
Yeah, and the definition of democracy, which I've heard you say many times, is the willingness for us to speak and share political space with
Right.
those who we disagree.
Right. The
If
willingness
we don't
to
teach
share
that,
political space with those with whom we disagree. And you can't know that unless you're taught it. And if you're not taught it, you are the consequence of that. And we have actually, in the last 50, 60 years, lost any knowledge of the concept of preparation and the concept of consequence on a national level and on a personal level.
And you got back your point about Hamilton and Jefferson hating each other, and I think that one of those important lessons historically for people to understand is that today we're in a dangerous position where we, as you said, we've lost the ability to talk, to dialogue, to share space and disagree. And at the same time, we're exposed to all the information in the world at the palm of our hand, right here in our phones, but we don't know how to use it. And just a little bit of information is more dangerous, I think, than knowing sort of what to do with it and how to understand it. And
Or you
so,
think it was the lack of ability to get to the information.
right before.
That's
So
the problem.
now someone says, "Well, I believe tax policy X is the way to go." And I know one story about Jefferson, and so I'm going to use Jefferson to justify my position on why this is. And that's problematic because the reality is the founding fathers disagreed on a lot of things. If America is anything, it's an ongoing debate. It's an ongoing argument.
I could hear Jefferson coming back and go, wait, I wrote that with a feather pen. You're still using
Yeah, right, exactly. Right. Well, I love that too. It's like, what would Jefferson think about that? He would be amazed that we're driving in cars. I mean, it would be, we're so far removed. But the idea that America is one thing is fundamentally flawed. I mean, the founding fathers themselves were debating all sorts of things that we today should continue to debate. What is the balance of power between the state and the federal government? What is the definition of citizenship? What rights are inalienable? How do we achieve these things? And it's okay to disagree, but if the starting position is, well, America is this one thing and that justifies what I believe, then that's a conversation stopper, not a conversation starter.
Right.
Yeah.
There's the
Dividing,
fact.
for sure.
Yeah.
There's the fact that America is a country that is a work in progress. That America is changing. We don't think of all countries as that. We don't think of France as changing. We don't want to think of France as that. And France doesn't want to think that it's changing. France is France. And if anything bobbles that or shakes that, we're all against it. But when you turn to America and say that's also a thing that is unchanging, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't fit. Because America is a changing thing. It's a work in progress.
We've been growing since day one. We're constantly growing.
And we don't recognize the moments that it was right after we lost 700,000 sons and husbands, 700,000 fathers who came home, who didn't come home. And those that did were crippled. And it wasn't until the turn of the
Not
century.
even just physically, but mentally, that we're talking about too.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
PTSD.
What was the population then if we're going against 700,000? I'm just trying to
There
figure
was,
the
I
percentage.
think it was 4 million. I have written it down.
No, it's
What
the
are-
population of the
United
South was 9 million, 4 million of whom were enslaved, and the population of the North was what, 13? I think total you're around 24,000 ish, 25. Or I'm sorry, million, 25 million.
people total.
Yeah.
And yet we didn't count correctly because there were more blacks in the South than whites. And they were not accepted
Those
within...
casualties were not counted
Right.
necessarily as bodies.
They were counted as taxable income in one strange way. They were 4/5 of a person, and it was weird. They had to create a Rube Goldberg device in the South to justify slavery. And at the same time, we've done the same thing in terms of race. I think, personally, that if the bullet that killed Lincoln had missed or had wounded, if Lincoln as an individual had lived, this whole world would be different. Because he was a unique man in that he was certainly a man of his time. He started out with the same prejudices and bigotries but he was a man who thought. And when he got into the arena, the boxing arena of politics, he rose and he became a man capable of more change, more willingness to change and think than any other American president. And if he had been able to stay alive he would have understood that the war was not a war. It was not an event. It was Act One of an event that never happened. It was Act One of the new America.
What needed to be done, or what still needs to be done, that we can't do to rectify?
The things we had to do were only doable because of the trauma of the war. And if we didn't do them then, we would never do them. The consensus was, we would never have a consensus.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to, I think about all of U.S. history, the Civil War in particular. But I actually asked my students this question. If you look at major moments in U.S. history, whether it's the Revolution and Founding, the Market Revolution, the 1830s, the Civil War and Reconstruction, World War I, World War II, the Depression, all these things, even today, right, with COVID-19 and this reawakening of this race consciousness, these are extraordinary moments. And the question is, are they transformative and revolutionary moments, or are they just extraordinary moments? Does what comes out of it look the same as what was before it? And in some ways, yes. In some ways, no. And yes, slavery did end. But did the control of black people's lives change? No. Did their rights? No. But of course, they also had the groundwork laid with things like the 14th and 15th Amendment. But and in some ways, Act 3, I guess, then becomes something like the Civil Rights Movement, which is many called the Second Reconstruction. And Reconstruction really is, again, the Act 2 of Act 1, which you're talking about, which is the war and emancipation. And all of these things are connected. And the thing that I would say is, we talk about the Civil War, we love it. We can surround ourselves with all kinds of neat things, and we can even talk about this stuff if you want.
Yeah.
But it feels distant. It was 150 years ago.
It was then.
It was then, right.
It's really not
It was
that
an
long
It's
ago
not that
if
long
you
ago.
think
about
it.
this. A person born into slavery at the beginning of the Civil War would have been in their 80s in the 1940s when my parents were born. Right? So there were people alive when my parents were born, and then there's me. We're not that far removed. And the other thing that people forget is, and this is a rough analogy, because history doesn't work in a straight linear line. We talked about that. There's lots of little variables and factors. But it's a set of dominoes. So if I set a row of dominoes up from the kitchen over to here, that domino is 150 dominoes away. It doesn't seem like it in any way affect me. But when that domino falls over, it's going to hit one that's 149 away from me. And then that's going to hit one that's 148 away from me. And eventually, it's going to get to this present moment right now. And that's exactly what happens with the end of slavery. Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement, the failures of the Civil Rights Movement, it gets us right up to this moment where it's really not that far removed, and it is directly connected to a lot of the issues that we're still dealing with.
And at the same time, we live as a consequence to all of those dominoes.
Right.
And those dominoes change us. When the first one falls, we start to change. And when it finally gets to us, we are not the same people we were at the beginning.
Yeah.
And then, but we don't know this. We only know ourselves later, after.
I've had this conversation with Dave, and I'm just like, our conscious being right now is that we are history now. We are living history. We are breathing history that will be studied 20, 40, 50 years into the future.
Basically quantum mechanics with the observant.
We are history right now, and we need to really be acknowledging that, and then taking into consideration of history as we know it, and learning from that, and being able to take key things that had happened in history and be able to go, okay, well, this is just something that's repeating itself, and this is how it was handled then. Maybe you take things that worked, things that didn't work, and be able to move forward with that. But we are history here.
And it provides, we are history, I agree with that. And I think you're right, these moments, especially the COVID-19, and now with, again, this racial awakening, it reminds us, it sort of shakes us out of our slumber. We think, well, we're just living in the moment, and everything's just sort of, this is what it is, but we don't think of it as being a moment in history. And it's sort of woken us up to that.
Especially with the whole COVID thing.
Yeah, exactly.
We're deciding to write the future right now.
Exactly.
Based on how we respond.
What we're doing is making the thing that will be, and so someone, 40 years from now, say, well, that COVID back in 2020 doesn't affect me. Well, I got a flash for you. We're right now making decisions that affect tomorrow. That will eventually affect.
Exactly.
And so with the other thing that I think history does is it opens up windows of perspective that allow you to think about things in new and different ways. And so that gets back to this historical education. It gets back to counterfactual histories, which don't necessarily, they allow you to think about things in new ways. This type of education, it teaches what I like to call the discipline of thinking and the art of discourse. It's a way of seeing the world, of thinking of the world, of engaging with one another, that allows you to see beyond the end of your own nose. That we're all part of this larger system that's creating and that we create. And the Civil War and Reconstruction is very much alive with us now.
If we stop for a minute and say, can we say that we are any different than we were 50 years ago? And what I mean is, the America that came out of World War II was the most respected, admired country in the world. And we had achieved peace in many areas. We had an enemy, but we were on the top of the hill. We were at the top of the hill, and the world recognized that, and thought of us as that. No one ever said 50 years ago, I can't wait to get to Norway. They didn't say, I can't wait to get to Czechoslovakia. They said, I can't wait to get to America, because America had meaning in this world. And America was thought of as having that particular meaning. And certain things happened. And you can nail it. You can say, this happened and caused many other things. And that was when what I call the James Dean generation. And they were the ones who were too young to fight with their fathers in World War II. And they were too old to take acid with us.
He's showing us in there again.
And the James Dean generation.
What do you got, Richard?
What?
So what do you...
The James Dean generation was without purpose, without mission. They were between the heroism of their fathers and suburban blah.
Mm-hmm. Did Hunter S. Thompson write an article about this? He sort of identified this sort of lost generation after World War II, and he traveled around with them. And I want to say they were bikers. I know a lot of whom were World War II, but maybe that, I don't know. You're making me think of something. And in some ways, I've seen it now rewritten that maybe in some ways he was predicting this moment we find ourselves in now with this political.
Well, I think you can actually track it. That these people, our James Dean generation, our older brothers or fathers, they were in power in the early 1970s. They were in school boards, and they had witnessed the 1960s. They had not experienced hippiedom, but they had an education in civics, and they saw the 60s as a terrible defeat. They saw the blood and chaos of the Democratic Convention, and they were not able to see and not willing to see the other way of looking at the 60s, which was a great kind of exercise of the Bill of Rights. That's how we thought of it. We thought of it as a great way of identifying with the founding fathers.
It was righteous.
There was a war.
Yeah.
There was an illegal war going on. It was illegal. It did not have a declaration of war by Congress, and it was
So
illegal.
participatory citizenship was dangerous at that point.
Well, that was the end of it. The beginning was we were in the streets fighting an illegal war. We thought we were heroes. We thought we were the best of Americans because we were identifying with the founding fathers. Our James Dean generation didn't see it that way. They saw rules shattered and families shattered and things fought over that had never been fought over. Genders and drugs. And they saw
Music. Dance.
well, and that all came out of that. Once you see a CBS reporter being arrested on the floor of the Democratic Convention, anything goes. Anything goes.
And that's just what happened yesterday. We'll see if anything goes now. The CNN reporter got arrested.
Well,
We'll
we're
see.
such
Yeah.
a different people.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's
That's right.
And that's what
Yeah.
we have to talk about.
But at that time, that's when we decided to move civics to social
See, this is
Yeah,
what
right,
happened
Social
was,
studies,
right.
exactly.
Right.
what happened was
Right.
milk
that
down, watered down version.
we have a revolution. We are the children of the most famous and most important political revolution in history. We changed the exercise of government so radically that it was disdained and held in contempt for a century after we had won, and we created a participatory citizen, a citizen who we trained to be active and to run the country. And that was who we are. So when the James Dean generation found itself having an argument with this, they said to themselves that participatory citizenship is the danger of what caused all this crap in the 60s. And they knew that they could never say that they were against participatory citizenship. It was our mythology.
Right.
So they did the smartest thing they could. They took it from history class and put it into social studies, and it became a kind of gentle overview of our way of life.
Right.
Not the actual act of revolution that created a theory of governance that was so radical that it held all kings and monarchs in contempt. And how long after monarchy in any of its guises had ruled us from the beginning of civilization, monarchs, bloodline, even if it was the
10,000
bloodline
years.
of sadists.
Yeah.
And how long did it take for monarchy to become a punchline, a joke? It wasn't long.
Yeah.
A couple of hundred
Yeah, I was
years.
gonna say by
It was
about World War One.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was because
Yeah.
we proved that democracy, if held in check by a republic,
Right.
could work.
Right.
But aren't we going right back to there if we don't start teaching
Well,
that they have
and
that
that's,
right?
and
I mean,
so the
they
problem
went
is,
for running it. pretty
the
much.
problem is, it's not that we're the same people that we were before the
Different mindset,
1970s.
completely, yeah.
We are weaker, stupider, dumber, less active, more passive, not willing
By
to
design,
be
possibly.
participatory citizens. We are willing to be passive observers of America. We are like the guy driving down the freeway who sees a terrible accident, and that's called America. And he just goes, wow, that was.
And I see that in higher education where I have, there are a lot of students who are there to engage and to think and to be critical, but a lot of them sort of, they think of it as a DMV class, right? It's, you come in, you jump through the hoops, you get your stamp, and then you're able to go get your job and you move on. And
Yeah, it's just a resume.
it's right. And there's something to that. You need to build job skills and we all need to get paid. But, to me, it's, no, there's value in the act of the thinking and the difficulty. Students, gosh, this is so hard to write. What's the right answer? I said, that's the whole exercise. The whole exercise is to struggle,
But if we're,
is to work.
if we're not reminded of where we came from only 250 years ago,
Yeah.
and 10,000 years of punishment, we're not going to appreciate it or understand it.
Well,
There's so much
and we're
we don't
certainly not going to enjoy the actuality of the debate and
Yeah.
the discussion.
Yeah.
And that's really, we have eviscerated the education in public schools to such a degree that when I was going to school, and you tell me if I'm wrong, the younger people here, seriously, when I was going to school, we had a music department that had orchestras and symphonies, and we had, you could learn to conduct, you could learn all kinds of music, and they were cut, and they're gone.
Are they gone?
I graduated from high school in 2008, and I was fortunate enough where I was very involved in drama, but it was certainly not, you weren't encouraged to go into the arts. It was, if you want to get into a 4-year school, you have to be on this track, and you only have one little, you could do one elective for your entire high school career, which was not going to work for me because I wanted to act and I wanted to be in drama. And I know I work with a lot of kids now, and a lot of their science departments are getting cut.
Science now.
Yep.
But that goes back to budgets and tax policies.
But the thing is,
yeah.
what's really funny about that, what's really terrifying about that, is that all of the cutting began because of science, to save science, to keep science. You know, I ran into a bunch of superintendents once, many years ago.
Sounds like the beginning of a joke, kind of.
Seven superintendents.
A bunch
enter
more.
bar. But I was at LAX and I ran into this group of guys. And I said, is it true that you're asking for trigonometry and calculus in high school? Because let me tell you, I'm the only graduate of my high school that got out without geometry.
Okay.
Because I never would have learned it and I would still be there.
Where did you go to high school?
Beverly Hills.
Yeah.
I was in the best school in the country. They couldn't teach me geometry.
I was in the same boat. I could learn so many other things, but math specifically.
So-
like that.
So
Why?
I
It's
said to
different.
them, is it true that you now teach calculus in high school? And they said yes. And I said, having told them that I was an idiot when it came to math, I said, why? And their response was, well, because there are certain sciences that are so complex that the kids and I interrupted and I said, and when the dictator from Myanmar asks an American high school graduate to come there to work for 7 times his starting salary, what keeps him here? And they looked at one another, and one of them said, I don't know, what? And I said, love of country, respect for the ideals of the Bill of Rights. And you no longer teach that.
Which also starts from the glory tales, right? When you're first grade, second grade, about Washington chopping down the apple tree.
Okay.
Um,
So what happened was
Glory
that one
tales.
of
It's an
them
interesting
looked to
way
the
to say that.
others and said, I think we made a mistake. And that's true. That's a true story. They made a mistake. They forgot that you have to teach love of country and respect for the Bill of Rights, which was the most radical idea of governance in the history of mankind. And now, let me tell you, we are turning our back on the fact that the revolution happened, and the revolution stood for an educated public body. We intended to create a resource pool so that kids were educated, and we could take from that resource pool the people who would run the country. And we deny now any ability for those kids to have a glimpse of the government before it's their turn to run it.
you can't help but think that just by bringing that back alone, the love of country, and celebrating our similarities versus our difference, it might solve all of the problems we're still having today with bullying and racism and everything else. Go, hey, this is love of country, the only country like Tocqueville
Well,
said.
you know,
have
every
bad
time
ideas.
you say
We
love
have to
of
remind
country,
ourselves.
every time that phrase is said today, the listening audience has a complete contempt for it. And we have to build it up from the beginning. You can't just do love of country.
It needs to be taught at that early age.
That's
6,
right.
7, 8 years old.
And if you don't have a country. And I'll tell you now, that's what's happened. What we all now can feel, I'm not talking about Democrats versus Republicans, but both parties and everyone else can actually feel a decay in our country. We know that there's something awful going on and has been happening for a long time because we can't stand one another. We don't accept any ideas as being respectable. We fight, we see a magazine headline, we don't read the article, but we go to a dinner party and fight one another over that headline.
Right,
That's right.
exactly.
And then, of course, the platforms like Twitter exacerbate that because it happened to me where someone made a comment and I responded, and then I got stuff back. I thought I can't explain 400 years of U.S. history and get to my appointment on time. Like I don't in this Twitter. Like I can't do that. Like this isn't even so if the purpose is to win, I could maybe get you with a zinger. But if the purpose is to engage, I can't.
Right.
So I have a question for you then. Given the ugly side of U.S. history, which we know is there, how do you balance that with your drive to sort of inspire a love of country? In other words, how do you have
What is the
both of
positivity
those?
there?
That's great,
Yeah.
because first of all, I never expected not to have the ugly part, because we're human. And as a matter of fact, the thing that is so respectable about the Constitution is the authors of the Constitution took into consideration the fact of human nature. There is in the Constitution an allowance, an understanding that men will be greedy, and men will murder, and men will do things that there's a kind of activity that goes on in the American Constitution that is the only Constitution, the only, let's say, way of doing things that does not demand a change in human behavior. Every other theory of governance, from monarchy to communism, demands that men and women change and act the way they don't normally in order for it to work. And they don't work, which is why they're so terrible. Ours accepts the fact that men and women will do bad things. And so I have a respect for their understanding of that. And I can't tell you, I can see it now. I can see that we don't study it, so we don't know that there is a radical difference between our government and every other government that has ever existed in any place, in anywhere in this world. And we should kiss the tarmac of this country, not like
Blindly
right-wing military crazy people,
Right.
but
In its whole.
we live in a sense of freedom and a sense of allowance. And it's not just opportunity we have. We have the opportunity to have opportunity. And we have allowed the brains of 98% of the human race to have free reign. I mean, America is an idea closer to a miracle than any other country in the world. And I don't care. You know, I come from the left. And when I say left, I didn't meet a Democrat till I was 14. I was raised by communists and socialists, and they loved America like nobody's business. The old left.
I have to say, because I think that's such an important thing, is that that's one of the breakdowns in this dialogue that we have out there, is that somehow people on the left don't love America. Or that if it's like, well, that's the domain of patriotism and love of country is on the right. And I think, no, I love this country so much. I don't want it to be messed up.
As I grew up,
yeah,
it was that the right seemed to have said, we own the flag, we own patriotism, and you can't have it. And as I grew up through the Vietnam War, that was my constant fight. That this is my flag too. This is my country too. But what's happened now is that the new left, when I heard that college kids had actually stopped right-wing speakers who had been invited to speak at a university, and it was the left that stopped them from speaking with mayhem and violence and no shame, I wanted to vomit. Because I am of the left. And I disavow that. Because my generation, or the generation that I learned from, held the First Amendment like
Sacrosanct, yeah.
it was any country that offered no inhibitions to religion and speech and press. That's a great country, and everyone knew it. And where I grew up in Bayside, you might yell and scream about the Mensheviks versus the Bolsheviks and Stalin versus this one and that one. But you knew you were in America and you were allowed the freedom to have that discussion.
Right. Yeah, no, and it really is. So much of the left tradition and of love of country gets, I think, re-upped with immigrants, with waves of immigrants. It's Carlos Bulosan, the famous writer, Filipino immigrant. He described America. He said, "America is in the heart," and so oftentimes, again, it sets up this false dichotomy. It's like, well, there's real Americans and there's immigrant Americans and there's left Americans and right Americans, and it takes an outsider to come in with his left politics. Like, no, America's in the heart. It's a thing. It's an idea. It's a belief.
And every immigrant wave has gone through the same thing. And when it was the Germans came in the 1850s. They were them, and when the Russian Jews came in the 1900s, they were them.
Italians,
Irish, and all, and Arabs, and it's the same. And now we have lost our national memory, and we don't know that this is exactly the way it's always been. I
it's
used
our
to
history. That's exactly what I was saying. That this is the way that it's been. It just keeps repeating over and over again.
Except now there's a hatred involved.
I just hate everybody. So is that okay?
That's fair.
is that fair?
Actually,
I don't pick men, women, race, tall, short. I hate it.
Equal opportunity hater.
Equal opportunity hater here.
That's the song that Tom Lehrer wrote. It's all about.
That's right. But there is something different. There's always been disagreement. There's always been division. There have always been problems. There's been racism. There's been sexism. But you're right. There's something different now about the way we talk about it or don't talk about it, the lack of education, the access to the internet, the way the internet and that as a platform or a space exacerbates the problem.
We're not taught how to research.
Yeah, getting back to civility.
How
to
think.
The internet is not a villain.
That's right.
The internet is a
100%.
library.
That's right. That's right.
Thing.
That's right.
And we have to learn how to use it.
Yeah, no, I was going to say it now. To plug the University of San Diego, part of their curriculum revision are these core. It doesn't have anything to do with core as we know it for those other schools, but that rather than teaching math and English and science separately, they're teaching skills. So it's information literacy and critical thinking and writing, and those can be skills that can be picked up in different courses. Anyway, the point is, one of the requirements that I have to include in every single history class that I teach is critical thinking and information literacy. How do you use sources, access the internet? How do you think about things? How do you attribute footnotes? And if my students walk out of the university, and this should be something that's happening at all universities, they're walking out not just knowing a set of facts, they're knowing how to think about that set of facts, and they're knowing how to research and continue their own thought in a way that allows them, exactly as you say, to use the internet as a resource.
See, this is
and not be afraid
all of what you're saying are the things that make up the word civics. Civics did not exist as a word until it was realized that one had to teach people who had never had to learn. No one ever taught the lower classes because the lower classes didn't have anything to do with running the country. And when they did, they had to learn how to think. And it was not that civics was taught in one class, in 1 hour, in one semester.
Right.
Civics
is introduced in history as part of the story of the War of Independence, and the word revolution sticks to us not because of that war, but because of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. That was the revolution. And we, as a country, knew you had an introduction to civics as you had to know it, because that's what we fought for, that people had a right to learn, that people had certain rights to learn certain types of things. And then the actuality is, if you had to learn critical thinking, and if you had to learn clarity of thought and expression, you didn't learn that in a class of civics. You learned that in home economics and in geography. You learned that in every other class because the teachers taught in a certain manner.
Right.
And you were not expected to know how to be excellent in clarity of thought until you were graduating. You had 12 years
Right.
of practice.
To achieve that, right.
We should kick off the importance of civility. Maybe do this again because we're out of time.
Yeah,
We're at it.
absolutely. Yeah,
I was saying, I can connect it back to Civil War and Reconstruction.
Yeah.
Because what is one of the first things that former slaves do when slavery comes to an end is, number one, try to reconnect their families, and number two, try to secure land, and number three is establish schools.
Yeah.
Because there is no education. And exactly, they recognize we need education to be a part. So it absolutely, it all circles back to
And I believe that's where I think my Lincoln comes in. I don't think Lincoln would have. I think Lincoln would have made schools ubiquitous. I think that black people would have become known for their schooling. And he would have known, this is all fiction, he would have known that the only way black people could get up anywhere in this world was through education.
Free labor demand.
Richard, thank you so much for being with us
What?
today.
Has it been 2 hours?
I know, right? Has it been 2 hours? I know that there's still so much more that we have to discuss, and definitely would love to get into a whole civics conversation with you and maybe with Professor David Miller as well, and Ron. I mean, this has just been so inspiring and eye-opening this afternoon. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
yeah, I know. Maybe we'll do a quick live after and maybe show off some of the artifacts that Dave brought. Maybe you can show Richard some of the guns or something sort of a behind the scenes as we're starting to clean up the studio.
Sure.
If you guys want to tune back in a little bit. But for right now, we're going to end this live with Layne. Thank you, everybody that joined in today. Thank you, Johnny Ringo. Thank you, Miss Amy. Come on in, guys. Come on in and say hello. Come on. There we go. Miss Amy and Brandon, come on in.
John, you gotta come in.
Come on. Oh, no.
John's on sound, so you can't come in.
So thank you, everybody. Thanks for the team. Thank you to
And
the
we'll do
Quarantine
this again.
Network. We will do this again.
And
yes.
we'll name some villains. How about that?
Yeah, we're going to start calling people
How about
out.
naming some names of people who are in office now and who deserve long prison terms?
We'll discuss your book next time as well.
Like the Secretary of
yeah.
Education. Okay? Is that controversial enough?
Love it.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the Quarantine Network.